They say every war begins long before the first shot is fired. For the Harpers, it started with a single argument in the kitchen over black coffee and a trembling radio that carried Abraham Lincoln's voice. Tennessee, autumn of 1860. The fields were still golden, the air smelled of cotton and dust, and the Harper farmhouse stood like it always had, proud, plain, and worn by time. But inside, something had changed. William Harper, the elder by 2 years, leaned over the table, his hands still stained with engine grease from the foundry in Nashville. He had the look of a man built for the new world. Sharp eyes, restless mind, always speaking of railroads, industry, and progress. Across from him sat Thomas, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and unshakably loyal to the land that had raised him. He wore his father's hat and carried his temper like a rifle. The words between them had once been brotherly. Now they sounded like cracks in the floorboards. "Lincoln's not our enemy," William said quietly. "He's the future, maybe a painful one, but—" "Future," Thomas cut him off. "He's fixing to tear this country apart, to tell us how to live, how to work, what to own. He don't know a damn thing about the South." Their mother, Martha Harper, moved between them with a trembling spoon, pretending to stir sugar into her coffee. She didn't look up. Outside, the wind picked up dust from the fields, swirling it like ghosts around the porch. "You call it freedom," Thomas said, rising from his chair, "but what you mean is rule, northern rule." "And what you call tradition," William shot back, "is a chain around another man's neck." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. That night, the brothers didn't share supper. William sat on the porch, watching the horizon glow with the last orange of sunset, and Thomas stood by the barn, sharpening his father's old knife until the blade caught the dying light. In the distance, someone's radio crackled with the news. Lincoln had been elected president. A stray dog barked once and went quiet. Somewhere, deep inside the heart of America, something ancient tore loose. By spring, the country was splitting like dry wood. 11 states broke away one by one. Flags changed, songs changed, even prayers changed. The same hymn sounded different in the North than it did in the South. In March of 1861, when the cannons at Fort Sumter finally roared, William joined the Union Army. He wrote a single note before leaving, left it on the kitchen table beside his mother's sewing needles. "I fight for what's right, not what's easy." He didn't sign it. He knew she'd recognize his hand. A week later, Thomas rode out in grey uniform toward Richmond. His note was shorter. "I fight for home." The same table, 2 letters, one mother caught in the middle. Summer came with the sound of drums and the smell of gunpowder drifting over Tennessee fields. Martha still cooked for 3, still laid out 3 plates each evening, though only one was ever touched. Every night she lit a candle in the window, one for each son, and prayed that God wouldn't make her choose who to lose first. On the front lines, war wasn't noble. It was mud, fever, and the taste of iron in the air. William wrote home about endless marching and men coughing blood into the dirt. Thomas wrote less often. His words grew shorter with each letter. "We hold the river, supplies low, the boys brave." Both brothers had stopped mentioning God. By the end of 1861, the land between them, their home, their memories, even their mother's prayers, was no longer a bridge. It was a battlefield. And yet, every night, as smoke from burning towns blurred the stars, both men looked north toward the same horizon and wondered if the other was still alive. When the cold came early that year, Martha Harper finally stopped setting 3 plates. She wrote 2 letters instead, one addressed to Private William Harper, Union Army, the other to Sergeant Thomas Harper, Confederate States. She ended both the same way. "I don't care who wins, I just want my sons home." Neither letter ever reached its destination. As 1862 approached, the war had only begun to show its teeth, and somewhere between those marching columns of blue and grey, two brothers carried the same heart, now split clean in half. They didn't know it yet, but before the war ended they'd meet again, not as family, but as enemies. By the spring of 1861, the United States had stopped being united. Fields that once grew corn and cotton now grew armies. The stars on the flag no longer stood for unity. They marked the fracture of a nation bleeding from both ends. The first cannon blast at Fort Sumter echoed far beyond South Carolina. It rolled through towns, over mountains, and into the Harper farmhouse like thunder that would never fade. From that morning on, nothing was the same. In Nashville, William Harper stood in a crowd as men in blue uniforms marched through the streets. Their boots struck the cobblestones in rhythm, the sound of purpose, of conviction. Volunteers shouted, bands played the battle cry of freedom, and flags rippled like waves of belief. William raised his hand to swear the oath. His heart pounded with the naive certainty that he was fighting to preserve something pure, the idea of one nation under God, indivisible. At the same hour, hundreds of miles south, his brother Thomas joined the Confederate ranks in Richmond. His oath was just as solemn, his reasons just as clear: to protect his homeland, his people, and a way of life that he believed the North wanted to erase. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a guardian. 2 oaths, 2 flags, 1 family. At the early battles were chaos disguised as strategy. Men marched into gunfire with muskets that misfired, uniforms that didn't match, and generals who still thought war was about honor. At Bull Run, William's regiment charged across an open field, shouting so loud that the air itself seemed to crack. But the Confederate lines didn't break. They waited. When the smoke cleared, the field was a sea of grey and blue bodies tangled together, and William learned his first truth of war: bravery dies faster than bullets. He spent the night dragging wounded men into makeshift tents, his hands slick with blood that wasn't always someone else's. The cries of the dying mixed with the chirping of summer insects. The world felt wrong, too alive for so much death. In the South, Thomas fought at Wilson's Creek. The air was thick with gunpowder and fear. Horses screamed as cannonballs tore through them. He watched a boy, no older than 16, drop his rifle and run, only to be cut down by friendly fire. That night, Thomas sat by the campfire, staring into the flames until they blurred into shapes that looked like home. He thought of his mother, of her candles in the window. He tried to remember her voice, but all he could hear was the echo of rifles. Back home, Martha Harper's hair turned grey in a single winter. She read the newspapers aloud to herself, whispering the headlines like prayers: Manassas, Antietam, Shiloh. Each word was a wound. She still wrote letters, but the postmaster stopped taking them. Too many were going nowhere. The war crept closer. Armies burned farms for food, tore down fences for firewood, and left behind fields of ash and silence. Tennessee, once fertile, now smelled of smoke and rot. One cold morning, Martha awoke to find the family barn stripped bare, doors gone, tools stolen, horses vanished. On one wall, someone had carved with a knife. For the cause. She didn't know which side had done it. It didn't matter anymore. Clean by late 1862, both brothers had seen more horror than their father had in his lifetime. William wrote one final letter, ink smudged by shaking hands. "Tom, I don't know if you'll ever read this. We started believing in flags, but all I see now are graves. The cause doesn't matter, the men do." He never sent it. He folded it into his Bible instead, tucked between the pages of Psalms. Thomas, meanwhile, buried a comrade in a shallow grave near the Mississippi River. The man had carried a photograph of his family, wife, 2 daughters, a dog at their feet. Thomas couldn't stop staring at the picture. He felt like he was looking at his own ghosts. When the burial was done, he whispered, "God forgive us all," and walked away without looking back. But the war had no rhythm anymore, only exhaustion. Men stopped cheering when new orders came. They stopped singing around fires. The words Union and Confederacy felt heavy, hollow, meaningless. Yet both armies pressed on, convinced that victory was just one more charge away. By winter, rumors spread of a massive battle brewing near the Tennessee border, a place called Shiloh, where the ground was soft and the trees were thick enough to hide 1,000 ghosts. Neither brother knew it yet, but fate was leading them there. In the farmhouse, Martha lit 2 candles again. She whispered to the empty chairs, "If you're both alive, please remember, no flag is worth a mother's tears." The flame flickered as if to answer. Outside, snow fell in silence, covering the fields like a white flag the earth had raised itself. At dawn, the fog over Shiloh looked almost holy, soft, silver, and quiet enough to make a man believe peace still existed. By noon, that same fog would turn red, and the Tennessee River would carry more blood than rain. April 6, 1862, the Battle of Shiloh. The Union camp still slept under a thin veil of mist. Tents glowed faintly in the weak light, coffee pots simmered, and soldiers yawned into the pale morning air. The forest beyond the camp was silent, too silent. William Harper adjusted his rifle strap and squinted into the trees. "Feels wrong," he muttered to a private beside him. Before the man could answer, the world erupted. A cannon blast split the air open, then another, then dozens. The ground shook, the trees shivered, and the sky seemed to scream. Confederate troops poured out of the woods like shadows, 40,000 men, grey uniforms soaked with dew, bayonets glinting in the sunlight. The Union soldiers scrambled, boots thudded, rifles jammed, tents collapsed under the stampede. Horses reared, men shouted. The neat order of army life vanished in seconds. William fired once, twice, reloaded, then dropped to his knees as dirt exploded beside him. His ears rang, his throat filled with smoke. Somewhere behind him, someone was shouting orders, but the voice was swallowed by the roar of cannon fire. "Fall back! Fall back!" He couldn't see who yelled it. He only knew the name that flashed in his mind as he ran. Thomas. Half a mile away, across the same inferno, Thomas Harper charged with the Confederate line. The attack had caught the Union asleep, exactly as planned. But Thomas felt no glory in it, only a sick weight in his stomach as he watched boys half his age fall face first into the mud. His captain shouted, "Keep pushing!" Thomas raised his sword and yelled the same, though his voice cracked halfway through. He saw a Union drummer drop his sticks and curl into a ball. He saw a surgeon trying to drag a wounded man away, only for both to vanish under a shell burst. By midday, Shiloh was no longer a battle, it was chaos. Smoke clung to the earth like a curse. Trees splintered into jagged spears. The air reeked of sulphur, blood, and fear. Thomas's horse went down near a ravine, throwing him into a ditch. He crawled out, mud streaked across his face, and fired his pistol until it clicked empty. He looked up and saw the Union line holding, bending but not breaking. For a moment, across the haze, he thought he saw someone. A man with William's build, his same squared shoulders, his same way of standing when he was angry. But then another volley tore through the air, and the figure vanished. Or night came without silence. The battlefield groaned like a living thing. Wounded men called out for water, for mothers, for mercy. Some prayed, others sang hymns that no one answered. William stumbled through the wreckage with a lantern. He had been assigned to help find the wounded. Any wounded, blue or grey. The orders were clear: help who you can. He stepped over a shattered cannon wheel and froze. A voice, faint, hoarse. "Help! Please!" He followed it, heart pounding. On the ground, half buried in mud, lay a Confederate soldier. His grey coat was torn, one arm bent unnaturally, his face caked with dirt. William knelt beside him. "Hold on, you're going to make it." The man's lips moved. "Brother." The word stopped William cold. His breath hitched, his lantern trembling in his hand. He leaned closer, brushing mud from the soldier's face, and his heart nearly stopped. Thomas. His brother's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain but still unmistakable. "Will," he whispered, "didn't think we'd meet like this." William dropped the lantern and grabbed his hand. "Don't talk. We'll get you help." Thomas tried to smile. "You always said I was stubborn." He coughed, blood tracing a dark line down his chin. William shouted for a medic, his voice breaking, but no one came. The night was too loud with dying. "Listen to me," William said, pressing his palm over the wound. "You're going home. I'll take you there myself." Thomas shook his head weakly. "Home's gone, Will. We both burned it." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, final. The kind of silence that settles only when something sacred dies. Thomas's grip loosened. His hand fell away. William sat in the mud, holding his brother's lifeless fingers, the lantern flickering beside them. Around him, the cries of war faded into the distance. All that remained was the soft hum of the river carrying ashes downstream. By morning, the Union declared Shiloh a victory. William didn't feel victorious. He buried Thomas himself, marking the grave with a small wooden cross carved from a musket stock. He didn't pray, not because he'd lost faith, but because he no longer believed God had taken sides. He whispered, "You fought for what you believed, so did I. Maybe that's what killed us both." Then he walked away, leaving the cross to lean gently in the wind. That night, as campfires burned low, a letter fell from William's pocket. The one he had written months ago and never sent. The words smeared with rain. "Tom, the cause doesn't matter. The men do." Somewhere in the dark, the river carried those words downstream, toward the place they'd once called home. When the smoke cleared at Shiloh, the air still burned. The war didn't stop. It simply changed shape. It left battlefields and began haunting the homes, the empty chairs, and the hearts of those who waited for a knock that never came. By the summer of 1863, the war had swallowed everything. Tennessee was a graveyard stitched together with broken fences and burnt barns. Every road was lined with blackened trees that leaned like mourners. Every farmhouse had a window without a candle. Martha Harper's candle, however, still burned. Barely. Each evening she lit it, though the wax ran low and the wick was almost gone. She didn't know that one of her sons now rested beneath the soil of Shiloh, and the other wandered from battle to battle, too numb to pray. The letters had stopped months ago. Only silence came now. Pun William Harper marched with the Union Army through Mississippi. He had lost count of the battles, of the faces, of the graves. The smell of gunpowder and death clung to him like a second skin. He wasn't the same man who had left home with dreams of saving a nation. His uniform was faded, his hands shook, when he wasn't holding a rifle, and sometimes, in the dead of night, he heard his brother's voice whisper his name through the wind. At Vicksburg, he saw entire families living in caves dug into the hillsides to escape shellfire. Children with eyes too old for their faces. Mothers who didn't cry anymore. War had stopped being about freedom. Now it was about survival. Back in Tennessee, Martha learned to measure time by funerals. The church bell rang almost every day, slow, heavy, unforgiving. The town had no young men left to dig graves. Old men and widows took up the shovels themselves. One afternoon, a Union officer rode to her door. He removed his hat as she stepped out onto the porch. "Ma'am," he began softly, "we found this on the field near Shiloh." He handed her a small, mud-stained cross carved from wood, Thomas's grave marker. On the back, faint letters, scratched by a trembling hand. T.H., my brother's keeper. Martha didn't cry. She just took the cross and whispered, "I told you both to come home." Then she shut the door and lit her candle again. That night, she placed the cross beside it. The flame danced weakly, as though afraid of what it revealed. Far to the south, William sat by a dying campfire. He had received no orders for days, only the same silence that had followed every victory. His regiment was thin, sick, and hollow-eyed. A chaplain stopped beside him. "You look tired, son." William didn't look up. "I buried my brother." The chaplain hesitated. "Then pray for his peace." William's voice cracked like a dry branch. "God doesn't answer soldiers." The chaplain said nothing more. He simply laid a hand on William's shoulder and moved on, leaving him alone with the flickering fire. Till weeks later, William was granted leave for the first time in 2 years. He walked home, barefoot, for part of the journey, through fields that no longer looked like Tennessee. Fences were gone, trees blackened, creeks choked with debris. The air was heavy with the smell of damp ashes and unburied memories. When he reached the farmhouse, the door was unlatched. The porch creaked under his boots. Inside, dust floated in the sunlight like snow. His mother sat by the window, candle burning beside her. She turned slowly. For a moment she didn't recognize him. His beard was thick, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Will?" she whispered. He nodded. "I came home, Ma." Her hand trembled as she reached out and touched his face, as if confirming that flesh could still exist after so much death. Then her fingers moved to the wooden cross on the table. "I got this," she said. "From a soldier. Said it was yours." William looked at it for a long time. "It's his," he said finally. "Thomas's." "I know," she whispered. "I light it every night." The two sat in silence. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, but neither of them moved. When the first drops of rain struck the roof, Martha spoke again, her voice thin but steady. "Does it end soon?" William stared at the window. "They say it will." "And you?" He hesitated. "I don't think it ever does." That night, the storm came. Wind shook the house, rain lashed against the windows. The candle flickered violently, but it refused to die. William stood at the doorway, watching lightning flash over the hills, the same hills he and Thomas had once raced across as boys. He could almost see them again, two figures running through tall grass, laughing, unscarred by history. For one brief, merciful heartbeat, the world felt young again. Then the thunder came, and the vision disappeared. Read the next morning, the storm had passed. Martha's candle was nothing but melted wax, its flame finally gone. She sat by the window, holding the cross. William packed his rifle. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Wherever the war isn't." She nodded slowly. "Then you'll be walking a long time." July 1863, Pennsylvania burned under a sun so bright it made the blood look black. Men said God had abandoned Gettysburg. Others said he was watching to see how much pain his creation could endure before breaking. By the time William Harper reached the Union camp outside Gettysburg, he'd stopped counting the months. He no longer marched for the flag or the speeches. He marched because walking was easier than remembering. The hills rolled like ocean waves, green and deceptively peaceful. Farmers' fields had turned into staging grounds for the largest battle America had ever seen. The scent of crushed grass mixed with sweat, gun oil, and fear. General Meade rode through the lines, shouting, "Hold the high ground, no matter the cost!" The men cheered, but it was hollow, the kind of sound made by those who already know how it will end. William checked his rifle, wiped the grime from his hands, and stared toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills, the Confederate army gathered like a storm. And though he didn't know it, Thomas's regiment, or what remained of it, was among them. At dawn, cannon fire rolled across the fields like thunder over water. The first shots hit a farmhouse, turning it into splinters. Horses screamed. The ground trembled. "Artillery!" someone shouted. William dove behind a low stone wall as dirt exploded around him. The battle began in waves. Grey uniforms surged up the slopes, rifles flashing, blue lines fired back, the air thick with smoke. Every shot was answered by another, every life taken by one more. The noise was endless, not the roar of courage, but the grinding scream of humanity tearing itself apart. William fired until his shoulder went numb. He couldn't hear his own breath, couldn't tell if his hands shook from fear or exhaustion. Around him, men he'd shared bread with the night before now lay face down in the mud. "Keep firing!" his sergeant yelled. "Don't give an inch!" But the Confederates didn't stop. They climbed, fell, and climbed again. Among them was a familiar shape. Broad shoulders, grey coat, moving with determination through the smoke. It wasn't Thomas. It was another boy, younger, but with the same fire in his eyes. William hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before pulling the trigger. The boy fell. That pause haunted him more than the shot ever would. By afternoon, the sun turned cruel. The wounded baked in the open. The smell of blood was everywhere, hemetallic, hot, choking. Flies swarmed faster than medics could swat them away. William stumbled across a fallen tree and landed hard beside a dying soldier in grey. The man's lips were cracked, his voice weak. "Water!" William hesitated only a moment before lifting his canteen to the man's mouth. The soldier drank, trembling. Then he looked up with glassy eyes and whispered, "Thank you, brother." William didn't correct him. He just nodded and moved on. On the second day, the Confederates attacked the ridge again and again. The screams from Little Round Top echoed across the valley. William's unit held, but barely. Muskets overheated. Men used rocks when bullets ran out. By the third day, everyone knew it was coming. One final push. Pickett's charge. William stood among the Union line, facing an open field stretching toward the Confederate guns. Across that field, 12,000 Southern soldiers formed ranks in perfect, tragic symmetry. It looked less like an army and more like a funeral procession marching toward its grave. The command came, "Ready, aim!" The field erupted. Cannons thundered. The sky vanished behind smoke. The Confederates advanced through a storm of iron and fire, stepping over the fallen, climbing through death itself. William's rifle jammed. He drew his revolver instead, firing until the cylinder clicked empty. When the smoke cleared, the field was gone. Only bodies, torn flags, and silence remained. For the first time in months, the air was still. That night, as the Union Army buried the dead, William walked the field alone. He found a torn grey sleeve caught on a fence post. For a moment, his chest tightened. The fabric looked familiar. He touched it with trembling fingers, not Thomas's, but someone's brother, someone's son. He sank to his knees and whispered, "Forgive us, all of us." The wind answered with nothing but the faint rustle of grass. And back at camp, a letter circulated from President Lincoln himself. Words to remind the soldiers why they fought, why so many had died. William read it by lantern light, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. Freedom. The word no longer sounded like triumph, it sounded like mourning. Down at sunrise, the bells of Gettysburg rang. The Confederate Army was in retreat. The Union had won, but victory had never felt so much like loss. William sat on a hill overlooking the valley. Smoke rose from thousands of fires, thin and grey as ghosts. He reached into his pocket and took out a small wooden cross, Thomas's. He planted it gently into the soil and whispered, "You said we both burned home. Maybe this is where it begins again." So the war ended, not with cheers, but with silence. The guns stopped, the flags lowered, and America stood among its ruins, breathing, broken and unsure if it had won anything at all. April 1865. The cannons had gone quiet. The rivers no longer ran red, and yet the air still tasted of gunpowder and grief. William Harper walked alone down a dirt road in Virginia, his blue uniform faded to grey with dust. Around him, fields that had once been battlefields now grew wild again, grass pushing through the bones of trenches, flowers blooming from soil once soaked in blood. At Appomattox Courthouse, the war had finally surrendered. Lee's army laid down its arms, the flags folded, the drums ceased, and men on both sides stared at one another not as enemies, but as ghosts of the same tragedy. William had been there. He saw Confederate soldiers remove their hats as Union troops saluted them. No one shouted, no one sang. The moment was too sacred for noise. When General Lee rode away, someone whispered, "It's over." But William didn't believe it, not yet. He returned to Tennessee weeks later. The road home was long and haunted. Burnt towns, collapsed barns, and empty porches marked the way. Everywhere he went, people spoke in hushed tones about rebuilding, about forgiveness, about ghosts that refused to leave. When he reached the Harper farmhouse, spring had arrived. The fields were green again, stubbornly alive. Birds sang as if the world hadn't just torn itself apart. Martha Harper was sitting on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders. She looked smaller, thinner, her hair pure white. But when she saw him, her eyes filled with a light that war couldn't kill. "Will," she breathed, standing with effort. He dropped his bag and stepped into her arms. For the first time in 4 years, the house felt like a home again. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered. She nodded, but her smile trembled. The others didn't. He looked past her toward the field where his father once planted corn. The soil was black and rich again, and somewhere beneath it, Thomas rested. "I know," William said softly. "But he's here, always will be." But that evening, as the sun sank low, William went to the spot where the old oak tree had survived the fires. Beneath it lay a small mound of earth, marked by the same wooden cross he'd carried since Shiloh. He knelt, brushed away the dirt, and placed a single sprig of wildflowers on the grave. The air smelled of rain and life. "You'd hate this piece," he said with a faint smile. "Too quiet." The wind moved through the branches like a sigh. For a moment, William could almost hear Thomas's laughter echoing through the leaves, faint, distant, like a memory returning home. He closed his eyes. "We did it, brother. It's done." But back in the house, Martha lit a candle. It flickered softly, its light reflected in the window like a second sun. She set out 2 plates for supper. Habit, perhaps, or hope. William joined her, silent, grateful. "Does it feel different?" she asked. He thought for a long time. "No, just quieter." "Maybe that's enough," she said. In the months that followed, the country tried to heal. Men returned home with missing limbs and missing friends. Fields turned green again, though some refused to grow anything but sorrow. William worked the land by day and repaired the farmhouse by night. Each hammer strike felt like a prayer, to rebuild what had been shattered, even if it would never be the same. Sometimes he would stop and stare toward the road, half expecting to see Thomas walking back from the fields with that lopsided grin. He never did, but he still talked to him, out loud, when no one was listening. Years later, visitors passing through Tennessee would stop by the Harper farm. They'd see a man with grey hair and tired eyes tending to his land, a small wooden cross still standing under the oak. Some said he was a veteran. Others thought he was a preacher. But when they asked about the cross, William always gave the same answer. "It's not a grave, it's a reminder." "A reminder of what?" someone once asked. He paused, then looked toward the horizon, where the sun dipped low and the sky burned in colors that once matched the flames of war. "That sometimes," he said quietly, "we have to lose everything to learn what really matters." When Martha passed away in the winter of 1870, William buried her beside Thomas. He carved her name by hand into a simple wooden plank and placed it next to the cross. Then he lit one final candle, set it on the windowsill, and let it burn until dawn. That night, he dreamed of home the way it used to be. Laughter, music, and the voices of 2 boys chasing fireflies through the fields. When he woke, the candle had burned out, but the light stayed with him. So the war was over. The nation was whole again, on paper at least. But some wounds never heal. Some just learn to live inside the silence. William Harper lived long enough to see the new century dawn. He never left Tennessee, never remarried, never forgot. And when he died, the neighbors buried him under the oak tree beside his brother and his mother, where the 3 of them could rest in the same soil that once divided them. They said the night he passed, the wind carried the faint sound of a hymn through the valley. No words, just a hum, soft and endless, like a promise kept.